Welcome to the RPTS webinar series, a service of the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. I am Mark Sampson, the Director of Development at RPTS, and I am delighted to serve today as your host. Our webinar today is sponsored by RP Missions, as you see there on your screen. And just one other note for you, before we launch off, you'll see a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you are having any issues connecting or with your audio, type a message there and I'll be glad to help you figure that out. Also, you'll use that chat box to be able to ask some questions as the webinar proceeds or at the end when we have a question and answer period. Our speaker this month is Dr. C.J. Williams. He's Professor of Old Testament Studies here at RPTS. Dr. Williams did his undergraduate work at Covenant College, earned his MDiv at RPTS, an MA at Siegel College of Jewish Studies, and most recently a PhD at the Baltimore Hebrew Institute at Towson University. Dr. Williams has served as the pastor of Providence Reformed Presbyterian Church in the South Hills of Pittsburgh, and he's been on the faculty here at the seminary since 2005. When you talk with Dr. Williams, he likes to remind you that the Old Testament constitutes over 75% of the Bible, making it an essential part of the faith and life of believers. The Apostle Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 3:16 that all Scripture is useful for equipping the man of God. What Paul immediately had in mind there was the Old Testament. And so that is a central part of the ministry here at the seminary in preparing men for the pastorate. It is in that very Old Testament that we will start today as Dr. Williams sheds some very interesting light on David and his mighty men. Dr. Williams, the platform is yours.
Well, thank you for that rousing introduction, Mark, and thank all of you for tuning into this webinar today. I appreciate your interest in what might seem to be at first a very different kind of subject for these webinars that we have here at the seminary. Today we're going to be thinking about David's mighty men, and I think it is a fascinating subject. I just completed and defended a dissertation on this very subject earlier this year, so I have put a bit of thought into this subject, and I hope that I can concisely and clearly bring some of the fruit of that work to you in the next hour. So thank you once again for tuning in and listening. I hope you find it edifying and instructive as well. It would be very helpful if you had a Bible in front of you and turn to 2 Samuel 23. That's one of the main texts we'll be dealing with, where we find a list of David's mighty men. The list in 2 Samuel 23, beginning at verse 8 and following, is a list of David's mighty men that begins with a series of exploits by some of the most famous of the mighty men. And after that, there is a list, simply a long list of names of the rest of the group, and all of the men are associated with a certain place. It always tells us where each individual soldier came from. So one of the things we're going to be doing today is trying to look at that information and trying to determine, what do we learn from it? Why is all of that there? What's its purpose in the text? But first we're going to begin with a brief historical overview of the history of the mighty men. And then we're going to move to discuss a little bit about the origins, their places of origin that I just mentioned that are listed in 2 Samuel 23. And then finally, at the end of our hour, we're going to talk about typological connections between the mighty men and Christ's apostles in the New Testament. Basically, the thrust of that will be that as David, we see him as a type of Christ. The mighty men occupy a position, something like types of apostles, and we're going to look at those connections and try to demonstrate that connection. We'll finish the webinar with that subject. So let's begin now with a little bit of history, just a historical overview of David's Mighty Men. And before I do that, let me just say that I've found this subject and this particular text and this chapter of redemptive history, if you will, to be extremely edifying and exciting, a fascinating subject to study. This text is much more than simply a list of names that are hard to pronounce. It's a story of faith joined to courage. It's a story of God's strength at work in history through a small group of men whom he used to save and to defend his people and ultimately to seat David on the throne that God promised him. So this is a richly edifying chapter of redemptive history. And it reminds us that God uses the weak things of the world, small groups of men, outsiders, no names, and to accomplish his will. And so I think there are many good points of application that flow from this chapter. And hopefully we'll have time at the end. I'll make some of those points of application that we can think about. All right, let's begin with, as I said, a very brief overview of the history of David's mighty men. Now, the text that you're looking at, hopefully in your Bible in front of you in 2 Samuel 23, is a roster of these men, and the text comes late in the account of David's life. In fact, you'll notice just before the list of mighty men, you'll find David's last words. And that's pretty striking, isn't it? Because this list of mighty men is appended right after his last words. It's almost like his eulogy. It's a very important part of his legacy, this list of men and what they contributed to his life and ministry. But the history of this group begins in David's younger years, much earlier. After David was anointed by Samuel to take Saul's place as king, let me advance the slide there. I'm sorry I didn't do that. There's a brief historical overview of the mighty men and some of the main points I'll be making there in front of you. David began his career in a flight from Saul. He was anointed by Samuel to take Saul's place, and he was on the run from Saul. Saul was jealous and angry. And when David was on the run, we're told in 1 Samuel 22, when David was hiding out in the cave of Adullam, that people who were in distress and in debt and discontented gathered to him. And the text says he became captain over them. And there were about 400 men with him at that time. That's in 1 Samuel 22. But after that, David and his men were on the run from Saul, still hiding in the wilderness and fighting against the Philistines. But during that time, a group of his men began to distinguish themselves from the rest of the crowd and became known as the 30. And among them, an even more elite group emerged known as the Three. And if you're looking at 2 Samuel 23, you'll notice that some of the men early on the list are said to be one of the three or a captain of the three. And then later in the list, the men are in a group of 30. But these were battle-tested and loyal men who were particularly courageous among David's men. But by 1 Samuel 27, that same group grew to about 600 men. And at that time, David was operating out of Ziklag, a town in the south that the Philistine king of the city of Gath gave to him. And he was mainly fighting the Amalekites at that time. But during that time, David's mighty men were the most active. And shortly after that, David was crowned king of Judah in the southern city of Hebron. Now, after Saul's death, David and his men fought and took Jerusalem, which would be his capital, and David became the king of all of Israel, the united monarchy, north and south, Israel and Judah. And when that happened, David restructured the army, and several of the mighty men who were with him became his top leaders, his generals. And after that, that seems to be their limited role. They're mentioned only briefly in 2 Samuel. Some of them seem to serve as David's personal bodyguard at that point. One of the mighty men, Benaiah, who was one of the more famous ones, one of the three, also served later under Solomon. In fact, he did quite a bit of Solomon's dirty work. But from that point on, this group of mighty men really fades away from history. That's it. When David's life ends, when David passes into history, so does this group of mighty men. Now, another interesting subsequent historical twist. After the exile, there's some kind of institution or monument mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 16, which recounts the rebuilding of the walls and different aspects of the city. And it mentions something called the House of the Mighty Men. And we don't know exactly what that was, but it's mentioned in the same verse right along with the tomb of David, and it also says the House of the Mighty Men. So to my mind, it seems to be a plausible kind of assumption that this was something devoted to the mighty men, maybe a monument or maybe a tomb that held some of them, or some kind of institution or something like that. But it seems that they may have been remembered in that way. Now, it's clear from this brief historical sketch that the history of David's mighty men centers around David's rise to kingship. Now, they served a very specific historical function, and that was to fight for David when he was persecuted, and to establish his kingship, and to seat him on the throne that God had promised him. Then, after that, the mighty men just fade away into history. There's no other king of Israel or Judah. No other king in the Bible has a band of mighty men, right? There's no Josiah doesn't have mighty men, and none of the kings have mighty men, just David. Because their purpose was to establish the Davidic throne. Now, here's another text reference you can jot down and look up later. I won't do it now, but I'll just quote it. 1 Chronicles 11 also describes the mighty men. The list of mighty men is also found there in 1 Chronicles 11. And it describes them this way. It calls them those who strengthened themselves to make David king. That was their function. That was their historical purpose, to strengthen themselves to make David king. Now, that's a very important point. We're going to revisit that point in a moment as our time rolls on here. We're going to come back to that point because that's important for making New Testament connections. All right, so just tuck that away, and we'll revisit that point in a little bit. But now what I want to do is, if you're looking at that list now, you're going to see a feature that I mentioned earlier, the fact that this list includes a very prominent feature of listing all their places of origin. So I want to deal with that now and show you that there is some important information that we can glean from this list. Let me advance the slide here. All right, what you have in front of you now on your screen is a sample page of that includes the list, the beginning, at least the first 10 of the mighty men listed in 2 Samuel 23. What I did in my research, you'll see the list here on the left-hand side, 2 Samuel 23, and the listing of men. I assigned each name an ID number in the very left-hand column. And then I also compared it to the same list as found in 1 Chronicles 11. Now, there are, some variations and discrepancies between the lists, and a lot of my research focused on that, on sort of reconciling these two lists and explaining some of the differences between them. I'm not going to go into that this afternoon because that's kind of a very detailed kind of study, which we simply don't have time for, and you might not have patience for. But nevertheless, one thing I will point out is that there are more names in the 1 Chronicles list than there are on the 2 Samuel list. Actually, the 1 Chronicles list has 16 additional names at the end of the list. So the two lists are parallel for the first 39 entries. And after that, there are 16 additional names in the 1 Chronicles list. I'll come back to that and tell you why that's important. But what I did was compare these names, and then you'll see in the right-hand column, city, region, or family of origin. The bulk of my research consisted of tracking down these places of origin where these men came from. And that consisted of, looking at biblical information. Do we know where these sites are in terms of, are they mentioned in the Bible? Extra biblical information, Other ancient Near Eastern writings were sometimes very helpful in this investigation, and archaeological information. Do we know where these sites are? Can we track down these places? And what I found is there are some sites that we know exactly where they are. They're pretty easy. Bethlehem, for instance, that's an easy one. Harod is another one. Beth Pelet. Just instances here of towns that we know or have a very good idea where they are. There are others that we have no idea where they are. And most of the places fall in between there. We can make a very good, I think, educated guess at some of these places. So some are more certain than others. Most of my research consisted of dealing with the Hebrew text and maps and etc. and archaeological information. But I want to move on now and show you a general map here of the origins of David's mighty men. Now, when you aggregate, bring together all that information of the places from which they came, this is just a general map that shows many of those places, the ones that we can identify. Now, the very first thing I want you to notice is that the mighty men it's a fairly small group, and yet they come from a fairly large geographical area. Their origins span a wide range of Israelite territory and beyond Israel, from the Negev in the south as far as Zobah, Aram Zobah in the north, and throughout the Transjordan region. Transjordan refers to the land that is east of the Jordan River. So you can see there are men that come from that region too, beyond the borders of Israel. So it's pretty extraordinary, I think, that this small group of elite soldiers that David gathered would have such diverse origins. Of all of the entries of the mighty men, they come from 33 unique places of origin. Think about that. And no more than 3 men come from any one location. So that's not only is this group diverse, it seems that diversity is by design, because they are so diverse in their places of origin. Okay, let me advance the slide here beyond this map. Now, I'm going to take you through at least one small aspect of my research and to demonstrate that there is a pattern that emerges in this list, the geographical information of the origins of David's mighty men. There's an important pattern that emerges. Now, what you're looking at now on your screen is just the same previous map that we were looking at, but now I've divided it into regions. Region 1 consists of really the immediate vicinity around Bethlehem, most of the locations there falling within about a 20-kilometer radius of Bethlehem. Region 2 consists of the southern Judean highlands and the Negev, the desert regions in the south. Region 3 is in the northwest. That consists of sites in Israel proper, in the northern kingdom, and territories in Ephraim and Dan. And Region 4, as you'll see, is in the Transjordan, which is east of the Jordan River. And each one of these slides, I'm going to be building through this argument. Given that, let's advance the slide. And first of all, this first pie chart just relates to the regional origins of the original list. Now, by the original list, I mean the list you're looking at in 2 Samuel 23. The list minus the 16 names that are added in Chronicles. Okay, we're going to refer to that as the original list. Now, you take that whole original list, and this pie chart just simply shows, the breakdown of how many come from what region. Most, as you'll see, come from Region 1, 49%. Region 2 is well represented. Region 3 and 4 are less well represented. But that just gives the overall picture of the whole list of mighty men. Now, this information becomes much more distinct when we analyze the regional origins of different portions of the list. All right, follow me on this now. The first 17 entries of the list, all right, not so diverse anymore. 3/4 of the men of the first 17 entries, 3/4 of the men, 76%, come from Region 1. Okay, that is the region around Bethlehem, 20-kilometer radius around Bethlehem. And a quarter of them, 24%, come from region 2. That is the southern Judean highlands. Okay, so those are very distinct characteristics of the first 17 soldiers in the list. Let's look at the next theme, or the next portion of the list, entries 18 through 26 in the list of David's mighty men. Now, what you have here in this portion of the list is a fairly even distribution between regions 1, 2, and 3. But what I want you to notice here is that region 3 is predominant. In the first part of the list, there was nobody from region 3. In this part of the list, region 3 is the predominant region of origin. Okay? And I'll also add, this is the only portion of the list where you find soldiers that come from region 3. All right, let's advance the slide one more time. And now you have entries 27 through 39. Now you have region 1 in smaller representation, 18%. Region 2, a big representation, 55%. But now look what we have. Nobody from region 3, and 27% from region 4. Now bear this in mind. All of the entries in this list from region 4 come from these entries, from this portion of the list. And there are none here from region 3. Okay, so there's a certain pattern emerging that I think is perhaps made a little bit clearer here on this next slide, this bar graph that I have. Look on the left-hand side, entries 1 through 17. 13 from region 1, 4 from region 2, 0 from region 3, 0 from region 4. Entries 18 through 26, a fairly even distribution between regions 1, 2, and 3. That is 3 soldiers, 2 soldiers, and 4 soldiers, respectively. But you'll notice that all the entries that come from region 3 are found in this part of the list. Now in entries 27 through 39, I want you to notice that all of the entries that come from region 4 are in this part of the list. So there are some distinct characteristics to the different portions of the list. As the list progresses, there is a geographical progression to the list as well. All right, let me advance the slide. Okay, now what we're going to do is, I apologize if this next map is a little bit small or hard to read, but I'll explain what it entails. Okay, up to this point, remember where we are now. Region 1 dominates the first section of the list. Region 2 is evidenced throughout the list in small, even numbers. Region 3 is introduced by the second part of the list, and region 4 is introduced by the third part of the list. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to pair up this list, this 3 portions of the list, with this geographical progression, and we're going to see if that same geographical progression characterizes the narratives of David's movements that are found throughout the biblical narrative. Okay? So what you're looking at now is the first portion of the history of David's life, as it's recorded in the Bible. And I call this David's flight from Saul. That's the early portion of his, the narrative surrounding his life. And this map, I think, demonstrates that this first phase of David's life took place in a fairly defined geographical area, except one little exception. He took a brief excursion over to the city of Mizpah in Moab in order to to drop off his parents, to entrust their safety to the king of Moab, interestingly enough. So he had one little excursion there. But for our purposes, this map begins to tell the story of the mighty men when we merge it with the regional maps that we saw before. Let me do that. I'll advance the slide. Now look what we have here. What we have here is David's flight from Saul begins in region 1, which was the region of his hometown in Bethlehem. That makes sense. And that's the area from which David would have gained his initial support in his flight from Saul. But you notice his subsequent journeys when he's on the lam, he's running from Saul. He takes him predominantly through region 2, where the text indicates to us that his band of men grew first to 400 and then to 600. These characteristics are clearly reflected in the first portion of the list. Remember, what we have established is that entries 1 through 17 in the list come entirely from regions 1 and region 2. And that's exactly where David was during this phase of his life, regions 1 and regions 2. Okay? All right, well, let's advance the slide and let's move a little further along in David's life to the next period of his life, which I call Ziklag to Hebron. Now, this is the time period in which David, he was operating independently, kind of like a mercenary, and he was given the southern town of Ziklag. You can see it from this map. He went from Gath. The king of Gath gave him Ziklag, and from Ziklag, he mainly did his raiding to the south. So I put some arrows there pointing south and back north and so on. He did raiding there against the Amalekites. Text mentions he visited the town of Yatir, which is to the east of Ziklag, and shared some of the spoils of his war with the people of that town. Very notably, however, he took a trip all the way up north, right, to Aphek, up there, whenever the Philistines were about to engage in battle, and he was, subsequently rejected by the Philistines there, but he made that excursion up into the north. And then the final arrow there takes him to Hebron, where he was crowned king of Judah, the southern kingdom. So I call this his Ziklag to Hebron period. Okay. Now let's merge this with the regional map. Let me advance the slide. And what do we see here? What we see is that this phase of David's life takes him into region 3 for the very first time. Yet it also maintains and strengthens his connections to region 2. Now, this historical phase of David's life corresponds very well to the second portion of the list of David's mighty men, the second theme in the list, if you will. That is entries 18 through 26 in the list of David's mighty men. Now, remember, that portion of the list contained all 4 of the mighty men that came from region 3. Okay? Now, that's very significant, I think. What we're seeing is the geographical peculiarities in the list, in each seam of the list, as the progression of geographical information, as we track that in the origins of David's mighty men, it's lining up with the narrative of David's movements and the different areas that he went to and spent time in. So that's where we're aiming. That's what's developing here from this list. All right, the final phase of David's history I simply call David's campaigns as king. This is when he was king of the united monarchy with its seat in Jerusalem. And then he began to campaign, outside the boundaries of Israel proper. He fought against some other Philistine cities in the west. Meteg, Amah is mentioned there. Gezer is mentioned. So that was his campaigns to the west. And he also campaigned to the east in Moab and Ammon. He conquered Edom. He beat the Ammonites and the Syrians at Medeba, and where Joab and the mighty men are specifically mentioned. He fought with Ammon. And again, Joab and the mighty men are specifically mentioned in these Transjordan campaigns that David fought as king. Now let's merge this with the regional map as well. Next slide. What we see is that David's conquest as king of the united monarchy takes him throughout the Transjordan region and Ammon, to the north as far as Zobah and Maacah, and to the south throughout Moab and Edom. Geographically, this stage clearly represents David's foray into region 4. And this phase of David's career corresponds to the third portion of the list, the original list in 2 Samuel 23, entries 27 through 39. This portion of the list, most notably, contains all the entries that come from Region 4 in the Transjordan. Okay? So, basically, what we have seen is this. The origins of David's mighty men, that geographical information in the list, and the places from which these men came, roughly but truly does correspond to the narrative when you track out the places which David went and visited in the different phases of his rise to kingship. Now, what you're seeing on your computer screen now, summary characteristics of the original list. Entries 1 through 17. Now, the first column is the three themes of the list, entries 1 through 17, 16 through 26, 27 through 39. The next column is tribal associations. I didn't even go through that with you. We didn't even talk about the tribes from which all of these men come, but that was another aspect of this research. But in entries 1 through 17, the tribal associations are homogeneous. They come basically and mainly from Judah and Benjamin, all right? And that is in geographical regions 1 and 2. And that corresponds to the historical phase of David's flight from Saul. Entries 18 through 26 introduces a little more tribal diversity into the list of David's mighty men. The predominant geographical region being Region 3, which David visits for the first time in this historical phase, Ziklag to Hebron. The final section of the list, entries 27 through 39, that introduces foreign elements into the list. The foreign soldiers are found here at the end of the list that come from the Transjordan areas. Predominant geographical region, Region 4 in the Transjordan, and this corresponds to the historical phase of David as king over the United Monarchy when he, in fact, campaigned in Transjordan areas and found himself in that region. So, in this one little portion of my research, you're seeing how all that geographical information in the list of mighty men, while the average reader might just glaze over and think, well, what do I do with this? Not much to do with it. I can't even pronounce these names. I don't know why they're here. But if you track it down, if you really analyze it, and I hope I've demonstrated this at least in this tiny cross-section of my research, that it really does mirror the narrative of David's rise to power. So we can project, we can predict, and think of, we can conjecture, let me put it that way, that we can see David moving from place to place throughout his career, whether he's running from Saul, whether he's operating out of Ziklag or Hebron or king over Jerusalem. What he did was he gathered to himself elite soldiers, one from here, one from there, two from this place, one from that place. Wherever he went, he would pick up and recruit an elite soldier to be part of his inner circle of mighty men. Now, very savvy on his part. You can look at it that way. I mean, you're building a group of heroes, of mighty men, and you take them from this place, that place, the other place, give all of these little towns across all of the Israel and the Transjordan, give them a stake in what's going on, give them a hero, if you will. So a very fascinating kind of tactic. He really forged this group together from diverse origins. And wasn't that David's mission after all, to unite Israel, right? To bring all the tribes together under one throne and one crown, wasn't it? So that ability, or that blessing, was first demonstrated in his ability to unite this small group of soldiers, very diverse group of soldiers, but unite them into one formidable fighting force. So what he did with the mighty men, he ultimately did with the nation. That is, take these separate, diverse people and unite them under his leadership. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. Let's go on to the Chronicler's additions. Now, here's just a short list of the Chronicler's additions, the 16 additional names that are at the end of the list in 1 Chronicles. Now, a lot of commentators will say these are just pure inventions by the Chronicler and so on and so forth, and they're just, why is the list longer in Chronicles than in Samuel? Well, I think there's good reason for that, and part of the answer lies in examining the places of origin. Look at the places of origin in the right-hand column. Achlai is a family name. We can't really track down where they came from. The little asterisks in that column will indicate that I'm not 100% sure, so rather than making a wild guess, we just content ourselves with not being sure. But Reuben, Ma'akah, Ashtaroth, Aroer, Machanaim, Moab, Aram-Zobah, look at all these places. They have one thing in common, and that is they are all entirely from the Transjordan. They all come from Region 4. Here's a map of those places, of the Chronicler's editions. Now you see the Jordan River there. Machanaim is east of the Jordan River, Ma'akah, Aram-Zobah, Ashtaroth, the city of Aroer. Reuben, right? Reuben had territory in the Transjordan, and Moab. All right, so all of the Chronicler's editions, all the ones that we can discern, all the ones that I can discern and track down the place of origin, come from the Transjordan. And as the next map indicates, all come from Region 4. Well, I don't have that map, but you remember Region 4. That's exactly where Region 4 is. So if you take the summary characteristics of all of the 55 entries, all of the mighty men from both lists, including the 16 that the Chronicler adds, what you see is this. Look at the bottom, entries 40 through 55. That is all the Chronicler's additions. But notice how the additions perpetuate the pattern that's already established in the original list. Okay? Look how the tribal associations go. Homogeneous to diverse to foreign. Foreign. Predominant geographical region. Starts with 1 and 2, goes to 3, and then to 4. The Chronicler's additions continue that pattern. They all come from Region 4. And again, it corresponds to the pattern of the historical phases, right? From flight from Saul, Ziklag to Hebron, and then the United Monarchy. Well, the Chronicler's editions also come from that time period when David campaigned in the Transjordan under the United Monarchy. So what we can conclude from this, I think, is that the list in 2 Samuel 23 came from the time period when David was king in Jerusalem. That list was forged, came from that time period, probably right around the time of, late in David's career and in his life, and included all the names who were in the list up to that time period. But the Chronicler, who comes much later, has the benefit of hindsight and had a complete list or document in front of him that listed all of the mighty men that came even at the very end of David's time as king and the operations of the mighty men in that last historical phase. So again, just to summarize that point, the list in Chronicles, the additions extend the pattern that we've established in the original list and fit it very nicely. Okay, so I think we see a good a harmony between the list in that sense. Okay, that's just a little taste, a little cross section of what we can do with that geographical information in the list, why it should matter to us, and there's much more than that to it. That's just one little sort of cross section. Now, we're going to go on now, and we have about 20 minutes left. That's good. To talk about something that might maybe be even more interesting to you than pie charts and graph charts and maps and things like that, and that is the list itself and some of its features. I want to take you through some of these things and the exploits of the mighty men in 2 Samuel 23, verses 8 through 23. Now, look at the text with me, and I'll talk a little bit about the list itself, some of its important features, and particularly these exploits of the mighty men at the beginning of the list. Very first, you'll notice there is a man named Yoshev Bashevet, and yet he's given another proper name, Adino the Eznite, the very first man in the list. Yoshev Bashevet is actually a honorific title, a nickname, and it means in Hebrew the one who sits in the seat. And he's the first one mentioned in the list, right? He's the top of the list, the one who sits in the seat, the first seat, the best warrior. And his proper name is Adino the Eznite. Now, interestingly enough, there's no place name mentioned in the Bible, Ezni, or anything close to that. But from extra biblical material, specifically from an inscription by a 10th century pharaoh named Pharaoh Shoshenq. He's actually mentioned in the Bible. His name is Shishak in the Bible. He has an inscription in which he lists all these towns that he conquered in Judea. And one of the towns he lists is called Ezni in the Negev in the south. So actually, Pharaoh Shoshenq, he kind of corroborates this town as a place name in the southern parts of Judah. Just kind of an interesting twist of how we can corroborate that place name. Perhaps to be associated with a little town in the Negev called Ezem or Ezni, one of those two. But that's where this particular soldier came from. It says he killed 800. Okay? 800 men. Now, how does one guy kill 800 men? It's unbelievable, right? Most people would say this is either an exaggeration of his deeds or a scribal error or something like that. It's neither of those things. What we're looking at is a miracle of victory, a miracle of combat, a miracle of deliverance. And it's the same with all of the others in the list and their exploits. All of them are miraculous. All of them are single-handedly fighting and killing hundreds of enemies. These men are miracle workers. Okay? Look at Eleazar the Ahohite, verses 9 and 10. Ahoah, by the way, is the name of a clan, a family in the tribe of Judah. And it says he won a single-handed victory when everyone else retreated. He didn't. And look what it says. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. So what's happening here? The Lord is defeating his enemies through the miraculous fighting of one man. But it's the Lord's work. All right? That's what you call a miracle of combat, a miracle of victory. Look at Shammah the Hararite next here, early in the list. And again, his exploit is related here. Hararite, by the way, Harar, or Har in Hebrew, means mountain. And a Hararite means a mountain man, right? Someone who comes from the mountains. And that's what Judea was. Judea is a very mountainous territory. So people that come from the Judean highlands called Hararites, mountain people, mountain men. And again, a single-handed victory. And again it says, look at this recurring phrase, here it is, the Lord brought about a great victory. It's obvious that God is winning, fighting, and defeating the enemies through these single-handed miraculous victories of these men. Then there's a story about these three mighty men who break through the Philistine camp and get water for David. That's a miraculous victory as well, three of them defeating all of the Philistines. How about Abishai in verse 18? He kills 300. And then there's Benaiah in verse 20. Now, Benaiah's specialty was something different. Very often in ancient times when two armies would face each other, they would first send out champions to fight. You know, you send out your best soldier, we'll send out ours, and we'll sit around and take bets and watch them fight. Think about Goliath, right? The Philistines sending out Goliath and then challenging the Israelites, send out your best guy so the champions can fight. Well, they always did that. And it seemed to be Benaiah's specialty to fight the champions of other armies, because it says that he fought and defeated two champions of Moab. He fought and defeated a lion. He killed a lion in the pit on a snowy day. And then there was this Egyptian champion. The text says he was a spectacular man. Killed him with his own spear. So Benaiah that was his specialty, battles between champions. But as we look at all of these exploits here in this list, all of them, every one that I just mentioned briefly, in every case their victories are miraculous. Now, these aren't miracles of healing or miracles of feeding the poor, the hungry. These are miracles of judgment, miracles of combat, but they are miracle workers, okay? Now, not a whole lot is indicated to us about their faith or their godliness, mostly just their military accomplishments. But there are at least some small indications of how the Spirit of God worked in them in other ways. For instance, we know of the loyalty to David that Jonathan had, and also Uriah the Hittite. Both of those men are mentioned in this list. The three who broke through the Philistine camp and got David water, that was an expression of their loyalty and love for David, wasn't it? And Abishai, who is one of the men whose exploits are recorded here, one of these mighty men, Abishai, was evidently a prophet. Because 1 Chronicles 12 says about him, and you can look this up later at your leisure, but 1 Chronicles 12 says the Spirit came upon him, talking about Abishai, and it says that he said, this is his prophecy, his utterance of blessing, "We are yours, O David, and we are with you, son of Jesse. Peace to you and the one who helps you, for God is your helper." Now again, that is an expression of loyalty, fidelity, not only to David, but to David's God. So these men who had a deep loyalty to David and the God of David, they worked miracles of victory to seat David on the throne of Israel, just as God had promised. So the picture that emerges here is not of a mere band of soldiers with exceptional skills, but really something like a sacred military order that gathered around David, worked miracles of victory in fulfillment of prophecy. Okay, these mighty men were mighty instruments of God indeed. Now, as for the rest of the list you find there in 2 Samuel 23, beyond the exploits of the first few soldiers, we don't know much more about some of these men. But I think there are some interesting and important facts that we can deduce. For instance, and this will be important, I think, later for New Testament connections when we get to that point. First of all, the sheer diversity of them, we already looked at that and pointed out this fact when we were looking at our maps and so on. They come from towns from all over Israel. Now, let me advance the slide here because I'm talking about characteristics of the rest of the list. Okay, very diverse. They come from towns all over Israel. They're foreigners, as we mentioned, from Ammon, from Zobah, from Moab. They come from many different places. No more than 3 come from any one place. Okay. And so there's diversity to this group. I also want to mention honorific titles or nicknames. Now, skillfully woven into this text, we find some names or place names that are actually nicknames. A few examples. I already mentioned the first guy on the list, Yoshev Bashevet, and then he was called Adino the Eznite. And you're thinking, okay, a guy that has 2 names? No, one of them is a nickname. One of them is an honorific title. And then Adino the Eznite is his proper name. There are other kind of nicknames in this list. Look at verse 31. Here's a good, for example. You find a guy named Azmavet in Hebrew. Azmavet means in Hebrew strong as death. All right. Now, I'm guessing his mother didn't name him that. I'm guessing that this was a nickname given to a particularly fierce warrior, right? Strong as death. Look at the entry, Elihaba the Shaalbonite. And you'll see also, right after him, it says, of the sons of Jashen, Jashen, or Yashen in Hebrew. There's good reason to pair up Elihaba with one of the soldiers before him as well. Might have formed a group together. 2 of them might properly be seen together. But of the sons of Yashen, I want to talk about that. Yashen is not an attested name in the Bible, which in itself doesn't mean much. It can be a name of, sons of Yashen. But it's interesting that Yashen in Hebrew means sleep. It's the word for sleep. And it is a common metaphor for death, especially in poetic texts like the Psalms. So one of the things I propose is that this might be some kind of honorific, fearsome honorific title, something like Sons of Death, something like that, kind of like Azmavet, strong as death. And that's a pretty fearsome nickname for a warrior. I think also the very last man on the list, Uriah the Hittite. Now, the Hittite Empire fell about 2 centuries before David came on the scene. Maybe there were some Hittite groups left to which he could trace his lineage, but he has a very Israelite name. Uriah in Hebrew means the Lord, Yahweh, Yah is my light. That's about as Hebrew as it gets. But he's called a Hittite. And part of the reason, perhaps the reason for that, is that the Hittite name was a kind of a nickname that signified toughness. Okay, the Hittites were known for being particularly tough warriors. They had military prowess. They were known for that. That was their reputation in the ancient world. And so to be called a Hittite was complimentary. It would be to be called a tough soldier. Much the same way we use the term Spartan today. You call someone Spartan, you don't necessarily mean that they're Greek. You mean that they're tough, right? They're tough. They can handle themselves, that kind of thing. So Uriah the Hittite, he's probably an Israelite, but a very tough one. That's very likely also a nickname as well. And it's interesting to me that the last name in the list, Uriah the Hittite, in 2 Samuel 23, that reminds the reader of that sad instance of betrayal in the group committed by David. That's the very last image in your mind, Uriah the Hittite, and that instance of betrayal. So, what's the image that's emerging here? We're moving along in time, so we have to move ahead here and try to summarize. Let's put together the whole historical picture, then we'll go to the New Testament. While David was being persecuted, a small band of commoners and outcasts were gathered to him. He gathered them. He gathered them together. They were a diverse group of people. They had very different backgrounds. They were not the best of the best, the cream of the crop. They were the bottom of the barrel, weren't they? They're all those who were distressed and in debt and so on. But David gathered them together, and the Lord used them to work miracles of victory. They defended God's king. They seated David on his rightful throne. They fought against all odds, making it clear that their victories were the work of the Lord. And they serve their place in redemptive history. And after they are gone, their miracles are never again replicated. There's no more mighty men after them. And their miracles are not replicated after them. They came and went in one generation. And this is key. Their purpose was to establish their king and his kingdom. That was their purpose. Okay? Now, let's fast forward. All right, there's the overall characteristics I was just talking about. I forgot to advance the slide. Small, diverse band of outcasts worked miracles of victory. Their purpose was to establish their king and his kingdom. Now, let's go to the New Testament. Fast forward 1,000 years. In redemptive history, when David's greater son began his ministry, how did he begin? By gathering a small, select group of men around him, a diverse band of outcasts who ended up working miracles in his name. All right, that's one of the first things that Christ did in his public ministry. Gather together a group with a wide variety of backgrounds. But this group of men would be used to establish their king and his kingdom, just like the mighty men. And their miraculous deeds would not again be replicated after them. They would come and go in one generation. Just like the mighty men are only associated with David, so the apostles are only associated with the Lord Jesus Christ in his time and in his generation. Now, we have about 10 minutes left or so. So, open your Bible to Matthew chapter 10. And I do not have my Bible. I meant to bring it with me. I'm hoping that Mark has one that he can pass off to me very quickly. He's even going to look it up for me. Thank you, Mark. Matthew chapter 10. And what we're going to see here is the list of Christ's mighty men, if you will, the list of Christ's apostles. And give me a moment until I get that list in front of me. Okay, very good. I'm looking at Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Okay? Have that text in front of you, please. I'm not going to take the time to read it right now out loud. I'm going to depend on you being there and looking at it. But let's do a comparison here. Advance the slide. Comparison of the list of David's mighty men and Christ's apostles. I am convinced, 100% convinced, that this list in Matthew 10, verses 1 through 4, is patterned after 2 Samuel 23. There are some obvious literary connections between these lists. Now, the lists begin the same way. Look at chapter Matthew 10, verse 2. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who's, okay. That's exactly the way the list in 2 Samuel begins. These are the names of the mighty men of David. And then it gives the list. The lists sound the same, too. Both lists include information about each man's father, or each man's hometown, or where he come from, or what his nickname was, right? The lists sound the same. Listen, the name of the 12 apostles is first Simon, who is called Peter. Now just think about the beginning of the list in 2 Samuel 23. The first one is Yoshev Bashevet, who was called Adino the Eznite. You know, they sound the same. They have nicknames and the same kind of geographic or family information attached to each entry. Notice also in this list here of the apostles, the list progresses from the most well-known to the most obscure. That's true of the list of the apostles here. The first ones are Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. We know all those guys, right? From the narrative. We know the things they did and so on. Their exploits, so to speak. But when you get to the end of the list of Christ's apostles, you have Simon the Canaanite. We don't know a whole lot about him. Actually, if you think about that name, he sounds like he could be in the list in 2 Samuel 23, Simon the Canaanite. But he comes at the end, and the last ones in both lists are fairly unknown. Now, this is big. This is key. Both lists end with a name that reminds us of betrayal. Matthew chapter 10, the very last one listed in the list of the apostles, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. 2 Samuel 23 ends with Uriah the Hittite. Isn't that interesting? Both lists end with a name that reminds us of the betrayal that took place within the group. Now the difference is Uriah was betrayed by David, but Judas betrayed Christ. So that last name of the list leaves the reader thinking about that contrast, doesn't it? The last name of the list reminds us that David was a flawed king. David was a betrayer. But Christ, his greater son, was a more righteous son. But he was the one who was betrayed. But it's fascinating how that is right at the end of the list. And it just leaves that same impression upon the reader. Okay, other points of connection. Again, the sheer diversity. We saw David's mighty men. They include even foreigners, people from all over the place. How about the apostles? Think about their diversity. One's a zealot, one's a tax collector. You have someone called Simon the Canaanite. That's a pretty diverse group, intentionally diverse, isn't it? Just like David's mighty men. The fact that they were commoners, David's mighty men, we talked about them. They come from all over the place, no-name towns. They're people who are in debt, disgruntled, outcasts. No, the apostles, not exactly the cream of the crop either. They were commoners. They were fishermen, tax collectors. You know, the same kind of demographic, if you will. Nicknames, too. This is a very interesting point of comparison. Talked about some of the nicknames of David's mighty men. It starts with Yoshev Bashevet, who was Adino the Eznite. The list of the apostles starts with Simon, who was called Peter. David's mighty men have names like Death is Strong, Azmavet. But the apostles have some pretty impressive nicknames too, don't they? Weren't James and John nicknamed Sons of Thunder by Christ? That's a pretty impressive nickname. And we talked about the possible nickname Sons of Death in the mighty men. But James and John were called the Sons of Thunder. But finally, I want you to notice that this text in Matthew, the list of the apostles, just like 2 Samuel, also begins with a short summary of their miracles. Isn't that how 2 Samuel 23 begins? With a list of their exploits and the miracles that they performed, and then a long list of their names. Same pattern in Matthew 10, where the first verse is, He called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. That's like a summary statement of their exploits, if you will. And then it says, the names of the 12 apostles are these. So that's exactly the pattern in 2 Samuel 23. It begins with some of their most notable exploits, and then the list of all their names. So, God used this small but diverse group of outcasts to do miracles. to establish and spread the kingdom of their king. I'm speaking now of the apostles in Matthew chapter 10. But they didn't work miracles of combat and miracles of, destruction. They worked miracles of grace and miracles of healing. And these apostles only gathered around Christ. After him, the apostolate ends, just like David's mighty men. Now, so the point I've been driving at all along is simply this. If David is a type of Christ, the mighty men are types of apostles. If you were to talk about a small, diverse band of commoners who God gathered around their king and worked miracles to establish his kingdom at a key point in redemptive history, then fade away from the scene, you could be talking about David's mighty men or Christ's apostles, because that was the mission of both groups. The mighty men are like the Old Testament apostles of David, and the apostles are like the New Testament mighty men of Christ. Now, let's see where we are. We are done. I'll tell you what. It's 4 o'clock. Can I have 5 more minutes? Maybe I'll sneak 10 in. I just want to draw a few points of application. You might think, okay, that's well and good. You convinced me, but so what? What do you do with this information? Let me suggest a few points of importance of this study. First of all, we have to see David's mighty men in the big picture of redemptive history. Genesis 3:15 talks about the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And that is kind of the table of contents for the whole Bible, isn't it? The conflict between those seeds and the eventual coming of Christ, the seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent and the serpent's seed. That's a lens through which to see the whole story of redemption. Seed versus seed. Now, the mighty men are one battle in that long war, and the victory belonged to David and the mighty men. That is the seed of the woman. God gave them the victory. So David's victory, with David as a type of Christ, David is a prophetic foreshadow of Christ's victory. Okay? And this isn't some ethereal, spiritual, supra-historical battle. This is taking place in human history. Look at that list in 2 Samuel 23. It is names of real men who come from real places. That battle between the seeds is unfolding among men in human history. And we too are part of that same battle, that same spiritual battle that's spoken of here. Now, consider also the typology surrounding David and the mighty men. If David is a type of Christ and the mighty men are types of apostles, this is one more confirmation that Christ is David's greater son who sits on his throne forever. You see, the types and the shadows that surround David point us convincingly to the Lord Jesus Christ as the fulfillment. So, this little chapter on David's mighty men is more important, I think, to the gospel message than we might at first think. You might think, well, there's no connection here, but Christ did not just appear on the scene with his apostles preaching the gospel in the first century. Christ and his apostles came as the culmination and the fulfillment of so much historical foreshadowing and prophecy for centuries of history. This gives the gospel its historical depth and its power. David and the mighty men, 1,000 years before Jesus comes on the scene, they were living prophecies of Christ and the apostles. And that shows us how deep are the historical roots of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, the last point I want to make is this, that the weapon of Christ's kingdom is not the sword, but the gospel. Okay? Now, we saw David and his mighty men, how they could just kill hundreds of Philistines. His mighty men, killed hundreds and hundreds at a time. They subdued the enemies with the sword, didn't they? And their victory was a display of God's power and God's judgment. But it only foreshadowed. David foreshadowed a greater king. Israel foreshadowed a greater kingdom. The victory of David and his mighty men foreshadowed a greater victory. And I have to tell you that the weapons of the mighty men foreshadow a much greater weapon. Christ sent out his apostles not with a sword, right? Not to kill and to conquer with a sword, but to preach the gospel. And that is how Christ's kingdom advances today. That's how we advance his kingdom. There's typology at work in this whole comparison too, between the sword of David and the gospel of Christ, or the sword that the mighty men used and the gospel that the apostles preached. Do you ever notice in the New Testament how the Word of God is always compared to a sword over and over again? Ephesians 6, take up the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Or Hebrews 4, how it's sharper than any two-edged sword. Why is the Word always compared to a sword? Why that connection? Why not? You could pick any metaphor. Why a sword? Well, there's typology at work. Because what the Old Testament church did with the sword, what David did with the sword, what the mighty men did with the sword, we are to do with the word of God, the sword. And I have to add, they were right to do it. It was God's command that they do what they do, that they wipe out the Philistines, that they wipe out the Canaanites and so on. They were right to do it. God commanded them to do it. But what they did with the sword, we are to do with the word of God, the gospel. And, the scriptures tell us that the gospel is far mightier than the sword, right? That it is powerful for tearing down arguments. It can look at 2 Corinthians 10, how it can defeat arguments and tear down strongholds and so on. It is a powerful weapon. So the point here is that the gospel, the word, is a more powerful weapon. And it does subdue men and nations for Christ. It produces living disciples instead of just dead enemies. So the point here is that when Christ and his apostles came, they deployed a greater weapon than David and his mighty men had. And it takes just as much, I would say even more courage and strength to deploy that weapon, the gospel, because it takes not just strength as the sword takes, but it takes grace and patience and even love for your enemies to deploy the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. But it's much mightier than the sword. Let me finally just say this, and then we'll wrap it up with this last point. You can turn to a number of commentaries that will look at this text and say, well, look at the mighty men, how they were strong and they did great things for God. So, the application is be mighty men for God, right? That's okay. You might first think of that as being moralistic, more or less, or just being a sort of a trite application. But before we dismiss that, remember that the Old Testament church is full of examples that are there for our admonition. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 10, the things that are written beforehand are for our instruction, for us upon whom the end of the ages has come. That's for us to see and to find the examples that are worthy of emulation. Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith, gives us a bunch of examples to consider and to emulate. All right, we can and should look for examples of faith in the Scriptures and understand what is imitable, what we should emulate, and what isn't. And I think the mighty men do hold out a clear, simple, but powerful example to us, and that is an example of faith joined to courage. That's it. Faith joined to courage. They had faith, but there was the addition of courage to their faith. All right? They were very much involved in warfare, physical, real warfare, but also spiritual warfare. God's people always need courage in this world. As long as the contest between the seeds continues, as long as Satan goes about like a roaring lion, courage is needed. And in the spiritual warfare of the Christian life, it's not a game. It takes men of courage, and men of faith must be courageous. You might not have to kill 800 Philistines like Adino the Eznite, but you do have to take up the sword of the Spirit, and you do have to consciously and daily fight the seed of the serpent, right, with the word of God. So what I'm saying is this. This obscure little chapter in 2 Samuel lists 37 men who will always stand out as examples of faith joined to courage. Men who served the Lord no matter how difficult or dangerous they thought it was. They knew what their calling was. They didn't shrink from it, but God gave them the strength and the grace to do it. And they followed their calling. And they did what God had them to do. And what they did was extremely important in the whole plan of salvation. They seated David on his throne. They defended him, and from that line would come Christ, our Savior. And so they occupy an extremely important place in redemptive history. Okay, I am over time here, and I'm going to end with that. Let me advance the slide, which now asks for questions. Let me ask Mark if we have any questions.
We'll give Dr. Williams a moment or two to review a few of the questions that have come in so far. Go ahead and use that chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen to type in anything else that we have going on. And you will see on your screen our next two webinars. In October 4th, Professor-elect Barry York recently at the Synod of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America. Barry York presented actually what he'll be giving us this week, keeping covenant with our youth, encouraging congregations in the education of children. So that'll be our webinar, and Lord willing, Reverend York will be with us on staff here at RPTS in July of 2013. And then in November, on November 1st, Dr. Richard Gamble, Professor of Systematic Theology here at RPTS, will be taking us through Two Kingdom Theology, a very hot topic these days. And this will be based off of a discussion that Dr. Gamble led at the International Conference of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America just a few weeks ago at Indiana Wesleyan University. So if you missed that, you will want to take a look and participate in both of those webinars. I'll give you back to Dr. Williams as he goes ahead and answers the questions that he has. And again, last call to get any questions in.
All right, thank you, Mark. I have a couple of questions here in front of me. The first one is, I'm not sure from who it comes, but the question is in 2 Samuel 23, verse 23, what is the meaning of, he did not attain to the three? Translation of verse 23. If you have 2 Samuel 23 in front of you, the reference here is to verse 23, and it's talking about Benaiah and his exploits in killing the Egyptian hero and the Moabite heroes. And it says in verse 23, I'm reading, he was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the three. And David set him over his bodyguard. The 3 and the 30 are two different groups. The 3 was the most inner circle of David, the most elite soldiers, the ones who are first in the list and who have the greatest exploits attributed to them. So they are the elite of the elite. The 30 is the broader group. They were David's mighty men. They were elite, but they didn't attain to the top tier or the top rank, if you will. So Benaiah was renowned among the 30, but did not attain to the 3, to that upper inner circle of David. That's interesting too. There's a lot written about what are the 3 and the 30. Are they specific size group of men? Are they ranks and so on? It's very interesting study. There's a lot to be said about that too. It may have been the size of these special, elite groups of men, 3 on one hand, 30 on the other. But it's interesting to reflect on this, that in terms of the typology that we talked about, David has his 3, right? His tight inner circle, and then 30 beyond that. Christ also had a pretty tight inner circle. Not all of the apostles seemed to be as close to him as, there were Peter, James, and John. I would say that perhaps they were the closest to him. So there seems to be also that kind of, maybe Christ's 3, if you will, the few that were closer to him. So anyway, that's a quick answer to that question. I have one more question here from Steve. And Steve's question is that he was curious if my thesis paper included the New Testament connections, and if those who reviewed my paper and heard my verbal defense appreciated those connections. The answer is no and no. Everything I just did here in this webinar with the New Testament connections to the apostolate, none of that is in my dissertation at all. I did not include any of that, and that was not part of my defense or part of my presentation or part of my writings. That was just sort of some extras, some thought that just flowed from my research. I began to see those connections when I got into my research, but my research, my dissertation, 250 some pages altogether of research, focuses on their places of origin in that list in 2 Samuel 23. So that was the focal point of my research there. Anything else? No, that's all the questions I have. So once again, let me say thank you for tuning in and for listening to this webinar. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks again, and make sure you tune in to Barry York on October 4th and Dr. Richard Gamble on November 1st. All right, thanks again.